Or if your need for seed, exclamation mark. Okay. Interesting. All right. So I'd like to just take a minute, introduce our panelists. I think most all of you know me. My name is Julie Davis. I'm involved in running a hatchery and broodstock program in South Carolina. I'm just your moderator for today. I probably will chime in from time to time, but I'd like each of my panelists to introduce themselves, please.
John Supan, retired.
Scott Reichard, Auburn University Shellfish Laboratory.
My name's Tom Rossi. I'm the president of 4C's Breeding Technologies. We're the tetraploid company.
Kurt Hemmel, Base Shellfish Company, private hatchery, Gulf of Mexico, last 23 years.
Thanks, guys. Do I have to pass the microphone to each of them, or can y'all hear them without it? Pass the mic? Okay. So my first question is if you could talk about briefly the trend that you've seen in the demand for oyster seed in the past, let's say, well, let's go 3 years, because that's how long we've been having the Oyster South Symposium. Start over here? Okay. Kurt? Oh, and also maybe, well, you said you're from Florida, and Tom obviously geographically serves the entire U.S. Scott services the Gulf Coast area, and John would be speaking to probably primarily the Gulf Coast area.
The retirees in the room.
I remember when we produced the first oyster seed, it was only diploids, triploids weren't even a question then. About 8 or 9 years ago, and we were able to get 6 farmers that were willing to invest their money to try growing oysters. And from there, things took off very quick. Obviously, the other programs developed or had already been in the works in Louisiana and then over at Auburn. So in the last 3 years, what we've seen from our hatchery, and this is just based on phone calls, is the demand's gone up and down, but there's always been more demand than the seed available, or certainly more demand for seed when the farmers would like to have it. So I've only on rare occasions seen that there's excess seed in the market, and those may not be the times where the farmer would most ideally like to plant the product.
So I think to answer the question, over the past 3 years, the need for seed has grown exponentially. From our standpoint, where we're concerned with delivering products to hatcheries that allow them to grow triploids, frankly, the demand has surprised us and caught us a little bit off guard. Kurt and I had this conversation a couple of years ago, and we just weren't prepared to have our products available in the Gulf, so we've been scrambling to try to make it work. So hopefully we will meet demands in the future, but this year, the next couple of years are going to be a struggle for everyone to meet the seed demand.
Well, from our perspective at Auburn, we were providing seed for several years, and recently we've backed out of the commercial market to allow the private industry to take over. But while we were supplying the private industry, it's been a constant increase, and like Kurt said, an exponential increase here recently. But I'll reiterate something Kurt said was the demand for seed. Sometimes we see a lot of orders coming in at the wrong time of year. You need to think about your seed ahead of time and when you're going to need it, and let those hatcheries know that. Last year we saw a big influx of orders to hatcheries at the end of the season, and that's not the time the hatchery can plan for that kind of demand. But by the show of hands in here, I can see that there is quite a need for some seed. But I think that's going to be a two-way street. The hatcheries are going to have to plan better, and the farmers are going to have to help the hatcheries plan for that need ahead of time.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far. 3 years ago, to 2016, I was still at the Grand Isle Hatchery. I ran that for 28 years, and we implemented a long time ago a triploid program for the Gulf of Mexico, which has been very successful. And with Tom Rossi's help and Stan Allen from VIMS, we brought that tetraploid broodstock line into production mode in concert with Auburn, and getting vials of oyster sperm, studding out oysters, who would ever know, to the commercial hatcheries so they could make triploids, just opening up vials of sperm and dropping it in their beakers of eggs or buckets of eggs. Since then, though, I retired, and but I proposed something in 1991 down here that did not take off. Was remote setting of live larvae. And as Ryan Carnegie pointed out earlier, when you looked at his slide there, that the safest way of transferring across state lines or across region is eyed larvae. And that was one of the reasons why I proposed remote setting so long ago. So if you are in the need for seed and you can't get your hands on larvae, or if you can get your hands on post-set, small stuff that like barely won't even stay on a window screen yet, then start thinking about setting up your own shoreside nursery. They're not hard to do. You can make them out of a 55-gallon plastic drum. You just got to make sure you got wild oysters growing along your shoreline, so you know you got food there and the water's salty enough. That's one of the things you can do to hedge your bets. And it also, think of it as your seed warehouse. Because you can keep them in there as long as you got enough pump flow and water flow through that thing. You can keep those seed in there and let them grow until you got room on the farm for them, or you got a spot. So if your seed you placed an order for didn't come in when you thought, now all of a sudden you've got them, and it's your seed warehouse. So if you're really having struggles getting seed, consider taking the bull by the horns and set up your own nursery. You just got to be able to find something to put it in. Put something in it, I meant. Okay.
Thanks, guys. So Scott talked a little bit about how the farmers can help the hatchery and vice versa. Hatchery it's not Walmart. You can't just go and get seed anytime you want it. It's also a very finicky business. Things can go wrong in a hurry. I'm sure you all probably heard this before. I would ask the question of each of you, and maybe Tom, maybe not. You might have answers, might not. But what is and anybody else in the room who runs a hatchery, who takes orders, please, if I skipped over you or forgot you or something, please feel free to chime in on this question too. But if you're a hatchery operator, what is the number one thing you wish that your growers knew that are either, at whatever stage, whether it's placing the order, when they get the seed, when they put it out, whatever it may be, what is the number one thing that you wish they had a better handle on about hatchery operations?
Take care of it when you get it. That's a biggie. They may not look like much, but they're not as hardy as you think. And take care of them when you get them. Don't stick them in the refrigerator too long. They should be very competent when they arrive. And if you don't know how to look at it, if you don't have a microscope, if you're handling larvae, if you don't have a microscope, you're working in the blind. And if you have seed, you certainly want something that's large enough to a dissecting scope, and we to look at the quality, what's your quality of your product before you get it. If you're buying 2 millimeter seed, you can't see that with your naked eye. You could use one of them 10 magnifying lenses with the little circular fluorescent light around. That'd be a help. You can get those at Granger and screw them to the bottom of your table. But look at what you're getting and make sure. And I'm assuming everybody in this room knows how to count. I think the most valuable tool a grower can have is a hand tally counter that you can click away while you're counting and verify what you're getting is what you got. Okay, and a lot of there's a remote setting manuals around that talk about how to do this. Just read them. No, take command of your situation. and make sure that you're competent on how to handle what you got. So.
I'm going to follow up with John on that. For you farmers out there, when you get your seed, you should know how to count those seed when you get it, and make sure you're getting what you ordered. The time to come back to the hatchery and say, I'm not sure I got as much as I ordered, is when you receive that seed. It is not 2 weeks or 2 months down the road. Once that seed enters your water, there's a lot that can happen to it. There's water quality issues, there's predation issues, there's all kind of things that can happen to that seed. So 2 months down the road, you may see that, hey, I ordered 2 million seed and I've only got 1 million now. Well, the time to ask that hatchery about that is the day after you receive it, not 2 months down the road. The other thing I'll say is make sure you are prepared to receive that seed. Again, like Julie said, it's not Walmart. You can't just order it and have it shipped the next day. We have to plan way ahead of time to deliver orders. And there's no set schedule for it sometimes. But when that seed's available, make sure you're ready to take it. Because if a hatchery has to hold it for another 2 weeks, that's 2 weeks more labor the hatchery's got in it, and that's 2 weeks of expense they ought to be passing on to the farmer. Often we did not do that, but it really helps out the hatchery if you can take those seed when they're ready and not burden them with having to hold them longer, keep stuff crowded, back up somebody else's order.
So this is not a question that, for me, I think, but maybe it's a good time for me to point out how my company fits into the scheme of things, into the process. We actually develop broodstock, tetraploid broodstock, multiple sets of chromosomes. The males from our broodstock are used to fertilize local diploid eggs, and the product is triploid. If it's done right, it's 100% triploid. So we've worked with everyone here at the table, guys to my right for years, in developing tetraploid broodstock. So you don't know me because if things go right, you don't have to talk to me. Our customers are the hatcheries, and there's only a few of them in this room. They're the ones that you'll be working with. So I think almost every one of the newer hatcheries that are coming along has some experience with tetraploid, diploid breeding. So I think that there'll be a fair amount of triploid seed available. And one further thing about triploids. I heard people talk about planting 70% triploids. That is a very high percentage. My recommendation is don't put all your eggs in the triploid basket. It's, you know, they're wonderful animals, but they catch the worst first. So if something goes wrong, you're going to see it hard if you have all of your farm planted a triploid product. So there's room for both types of seed. Anything I can pass along to you. Thanks.
Tom, you're not giving yourself enough credit. Every farmer I know knows who you are. And yeah, I don't necessarily. The only thing I agree with that the previous panelist said was that going back all the way to Julie was order in advance. In most mature industries, whether it's in Europe, here, it's the clam industry or any other, you generally order a season in advance. And that's all a system and a market and from how the hatcheries exist in this market. Once it's mature, that's all you should have to do. You shouldn't have to worry about all those other things. Those are the things that you have to deal with in an emerging industry. When hatcheries don't know what they're doing, you have to count that seed and worry about whether it's alive, things like that. But that's not what you should expect and what you should have to deal with, in my opinion. And that's not where the clam industry's at and most of the oyster industry around the world.
All right. And I'll throw my 2 cents in on this question too, just because I would say, how many of you have been in business for less than 3 years? Okay, so this is going to be a worthwhile comment then. I want you to be 150,000% sure you know what size bag you're putting the seed in. Even if that means just bring one of your bags to the hatchery, so that at least I can know what size bag you're putting that seed in. Because a 6mm seed does not go in a 6mm bag. It goes in one size smaller, like a 2mm bag or maybe a 4mm bag, depending. So I would say that's one thing, very important thing that I want everybody to be aware of. And then just reiterating the early order and also the realistic order. Think about the space that you have for grow out. If you only have room at final grow out for 100,000 animals, you probably don't need to order 500,000 or 300,000. You maybe need to order, 100,000 plus about maybe 25%. So you might have an order of about 130 or 150,000, something like that. All you're going to do is shoot yourself in the foot. You're going to overcrowd your farm. You're going to get into issues. You're going to have misshapen product, thin shells, pest problems, all kinds of stuff. So just be realistic about your seed order. And a lot of, that's just, a hatchery might still take your order. Might not ask you those questions. I'll always ask you those questions because I want you to be successful with the animals. So, are there any questions from the audience? I know some of you were probably looking at this panel on the program and have a few burning questions saved up. Any questions? Yeah, Bill.
So, could you comment on what you think our production capacity is in the region? And I know it's complicated by states, but what's our production capacity? And Kurt and I had a conversation, like, what do you think we could produce? Because I don't know how many baskets we have in the water, but I'm curious how much we could produce.
Okay. Kurt?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question for not just myself, but the other private facilities, because I think there's a big difference in production when you're talking about a university system or the private industry. And what you tend to find, and what we have found obviously, is the university system will work on different schedules. They'll work during certain seasons, or they'll work, or they're not working over Christmas break, things like that. A little different priority with the private sector. So what I can tell you is there certainly are challenges producing oyster seed in the Gulf, and some of those are research issues we still need addressed. And I'll hit on that in just a few seconds. But as a background for our hatcheries, and I would say it's probably pretty standard globally when you go into different regions, whether it's France or different parts of Europe or Baja, Mexico, or wherever, you're generally going to find one or two large hatcheries, and they're going to be capable of producing 100 to 200 million animals. And so knowing that exists around the world in other places, that is the model that tends to occur, in situations like this. I can also say that we produce over 100 million seed a year, but it's not, obviously not oyster seed. So I think where we're at with supply and demand is an interesting question. The ability of commercial hatcheries to support the demand in the Gulf should be quite simple based on the models that exist everywhere. So I don't think that's where our problem is. I think we have more than enough hatcheries now. That's easy to say when you don't have enough seed. But what I'm saying is I believe that to be true, and I believe that we need to address what are the problems or what's stopping these hatcheries from producing this seed. And there are a few key things that we've identified over the years. And these are things that we went through in the clam industry over the last 23 years. And for starters, we don't have the ability to hold conditioned oysters in the Gulf of Mexico year-round. There are hatcheries that sometimes can feed enough, or in their conditions at that time they could have stuff that's ripe in December. But it's not guaranteed. At least I haven't met a hatchery yet that has a method that they've transferred from up north and been able to adapt it into the Gulf waters to hold conditioned brood stock continuously, so they can, at the snap of a finger, say, let's pull that group out and spawn it. And that is what occurs also globally. Most hatcheries are actually producing out of season in the largest oyster growing areas around the world. And what they're doing is they're preempting the season. They're producing they're conditioning those animals, getting their hatcheries up and running, usually this time of year right now in the Northeast, for production that they're going to do out of season. Well, we can't do that. I made a call yesterday to try to get tetraploid sperm. It's not available. So there's nothing I can do to help you. I can't speak for every hatchery, but I think these are some of the things we need to do. We need to ask, the researchers and the amount of university assistance we have in the Gulf, I think is really strong. We're very lucky. And I think, and all the great work that they've done for us in our industry is absolutely amazing. We've grown very fast in a very short period, but I think these are some of the things we could use help with. I think we'd like to get those methods and protocols for conditioning brood stock out of season. Certainly looking at disease-resistant stocks in different lines, whether they're tetraploids or diploid stocks. That may help with some of the losses that we're seeing down the road, even if we can't figure out what those losses are occurring from. A workaround is to have more available stocks. And so I can pass it down, but it'd be nice if we had some other private hatcheries chime in.
Yeah, well, I want to say a couple things about that, though. I want to remind everyone that this industry, well, first of all, the Gulf industry is still in its infancy. It's relatively new. I can tell you that even the tetraploid industry is still in its infancy. While it's been well developed on the West Coast for 20-some years, the first tetraploid Virginica is only about 10 years old, 11, 12 years old. A dozen years ago, they didn't exist. So you wanted to grow triploids, you had to make them through some alternative method, which gets into a whole nother set of complications. So this whole process is very, very new. And as it turns out, each geographical area has its own challenges. And Kurt's right. We are not prepared to be fully developed in the Gulf. We don't know about methods for conditioning tetraploid oysters in warm waters. We have no experience with that. That experience is going to have to come either on a research level, on a practical level. People are going to have to just try various methods and figure out how to do it. But before that happens, we have to get the animals. And developing tetraploids is difficult work. And we had to do a lot of catch-up here. At the present time, I feel fairly comfortable that we'll make progress. We'll have a fair amount of tetraploid animals available in the near future. This year is going to be a challenge. Next year we're going to be a lot safer. But we still have a lot to learn. And Kurt's also right in terms of what's needed in terms of future research. We talked about the involvement with the universities. They're the key to the research. Here in the Gulf, if it wasn't for LSU, there wouldn't be tetraploids today, because Dr. Soup and the staff down there, stepped up a dozen years ago before anyone even thought about a triploid oyster in the Gulf. Before there was any need, before there was, you couldn't have done that as a commercial operator because there was nobody to buy your product. How could you make that investment? So the university had an appropriate spot. It got the ball rolling, so to speak. Likewise with Auburn. Auburn's taken the bold step of stepping back from the production field. They're no longer producing commercial seed, which is probably good because now it leaves it over to the commercial sector to kind of fill in the gaps. And over the long haul, this is a model that's worked in other different geographical areas. Universities are involved in the beginning to get the industry going. They step back after there are commercial operators available to fill the need. And the commercial guys are much better at it in the long run. And that's really what's going to happen here. So we see that developing. So I think it's heading in the right direction. I think we're going through some growing pains, and this year might be a challenging year.
So the original question was capacity in the Gulf. I think the capacity is there. I think there's plenty of capacity. It's capability at this point. So we are in our infancy in terms of the hatcheries in the Gulf on the private side. And so while we have lots of tank space, lots of different hatcheries, they're not quite up to speed in terms of getting the numbers needed. And that's where we come in, is to help these hatcheries along. Now it's been mentioned that we backed out of the commercial industry, and we have, but we're still there to support the industry. And if our industry partners have issues, we're there to step in and try to help out. Conditioning. Conditioning is a big thing, and I've yet to find anybody that has the secret for the Gulf. We've just started looking at conditioning. Up until about 2 years ago, we really didn't have the need for it. But the industry has grown so rapidly that I think we see that we do have that need now. And it's when you're looking at getting seed at different times of year and trying to spread out your orders, I think it's a good thing if hatcheries can produce out of season. So that is something we will be focusing on from a research perspective. But I think as these new hatcheries come online and get more seasoned, I think you're going to see a more even supply of seed in the near future. But it will be a challenge for the next year or two.
Amen. Let me add to it.
Okay.
Tetraploids don't behave like diploids do. They ripen in the spring like diploids do, and they're about 3 to 4 weeks behind. When the diploid's starting to ripen up, you can figure about another 3 to 4 weeks the tetraploids are going to be ripe. But 2 years ago, when I was still in Grand Isle at the hatchery, our tetraploids never ripened again in the fall. And then, a lot of angst occurred in the industry because, we couldn't fill orders in the fall. And it was because the animals just simply didn't ripen. And it wasn't because of what we were doing in the hatchery. They were out in the farm getting the best water and food they could possibly get and getting looked at every week to see if they're ripe enough to come into the hatchery and ripen. They just didn't ripen. So there's still a lot to be learned about conditioning tetraploids. The hatchery, the first commercial hatchery in the Gulf of Mexico was in Grand Isle in 1990. And it produced, the first year it produced 380 million-eyed larvae, and the second year it produced 830 million-eyed larvae for spat-on shell. And then we had a historic rainfall in 1991. By 1992, there was wild spat everywhere. And by 1993, the owners of the hatchery didn't want larvae anymore because there was oysters everywhere. But they were diploids. And the reason why LSU went into triploids is because I realized that if a commercial hatchery is going to survive, it has to produce something a Mother Nature can't. And then right at that time, Stan Allen was up in the Pacific Northwest developing triploids for the Northwest industry that already had their commercial hatcheries. And that 1992, you can thank the year, and 93 was the year that triploids started to become, a focus here in the Gulf. But that doesn't mean we had it nailed down. And once we had to realize that we needed tetraploids to really make this happen, we're still learning on the tetraploid thing. So, and it wasn't until a year ago or two that anybody even wanted seed out of season. So there's still some learning curves too, but at least Scott's hatchery, and I know that those I left behind at the Grand Isle hatcheries are working on the conditioning aspect of it. So.
And I'll just add, if I can, if I have a minute, Bill. From an Atlantic coast perspective, our capacity is fairly small on the Atlantic coast. Our hatcheries that do exist are fairly small. The one in Georgia is a university operation, and the one that's solely dedicated to oysters, which is Ladies Island Oyster Hatchery in South Carolina, again, a fairly small operation on the scale of things. It's been able to meet the needs for the most part so far, but as the industry gets bigger, keeping up with that from a small facility will be a challenge. North Carolina doesn't really has well, Jimmy Morris's facility up there in sea level, but again, they're fairly small scale operations. So if there's people planning, large scale operations, like when you're getting into your permitting process and you're putting a permit in for a couple thousand cages or something, you probably want to reach out to the guy running the hatchery in your state and find out, talk to him, at least say, I'm building a business that's going to depend on getting seed from you. Is that realistic? And I would also just say that I would agree with Scott. It's a capability thing. I often liken the hatchery to the restaurant business. There are some restaurant people here in the room. A restaurant with 30 seats doesn't make a lot of money if you only fill those 30 seats once. You got to turn those 30 seats over like 3-4 times in the night, right? Or 2 or 3 times in the night in order to make money. That's like the hatchery. You're not gonna be doing very well if you only get one spawn off in the season. You got to get 4 or 5 spawns or something off. You got to be able to do more than just one. At least if you're going to have a small facility. If you have a giant size facility, you can do one, then good on you, I guess. But it's also nice to have those multiple spawns through the season, because as growers, can maybe get seed at different times during the year, which helps you stagger your crop a little bit. So with that, I'd take a couple quick questions if we have. I know Ronald had a question here in the back.